Hello everybody, welcome back to the Art and Storytelling Guild. Today's going to be our last day of this guild, so I want to talk about endings, the different ways you can end your story, and how to do it effectively. Endings are a very important part of your story because they're your reader's last impression of it. In the future, when they think about your story or talk about it to other people, they're going to remember the ending the most because it's the last thing they read. And because of this, you want to make sure that your ending represents what you wanted your story to be about. So let's look at the different ways you can do that. First of all, you may want to just go with an ending that a reader might expect. This sort of ending might have been the clear, obvious ending for the story even since the beginning. Whether the reader figures this out through their own intuition or maybe some sort of prophecy or vision of the future that you provide them with, the reader is always going to know that this is how it had to end. And while some people may find that boring or underwhelming, a lot of people might also think that it's satisfying or comforting or heartwarming. An important thing to remember about this kind of ending is that you want it to fit with whatever genre your story was. If it's a mystery novel, you have it end with them catching the killer. If it's a fantasy adventure, you end with them slaying the dragon. And honestly, this is a general good rule about all endings. Even if you have some strange, unexpected ending, you want it to still be in line with whatever genre you picked, or else it's just going to confuse the reader. Another type of ending you may choose to use is a cliffhanger. And this ending is mostly used in TV series or other sorts of series of stories. And that's because this sort of ending isn't the actual end for your story. A cliffhanger is done by ending the story or cutting it off right at the climax or what the reader thinks is the climax. It usually suggests that there's going to be another story coming after this in which you see what happens because of this action. This ending builds on the suspense that you've built up over your story, but most importantly, it gets the reader interested and invested for when you put out the next story. You may want to use this ending if your story is part of a larger saga or series of stories, one really, really long story. You don't want to use this ending if this story is all you're going to do. If you don't plan on writing anymore, you really shouldn't end it on a cliffhanger because it'll often just confuse and frustrate the reader because then they don't get a conclusion to your story or a resolution to the conflict. The next two endings we'll talk about are pretty similar on the surface, but there are some very important differences between them. The first of these is a mysterious ending. To achieve this ending, you're going to need to already have your main conflict resolved. This is just dealing with the aftermath. And to add the mystery to this, there's some details about the ending that you might want to omit. The reader may not get to know what the characters do afterwards, or where they go, or what happens to the environment they're in after the story ends. And these can be very important parts of your ending. So if you choose to not answer these questions, you really want to suggest or imply what happened without saying it outright. Some of the advantages of this ending is that it gets your reader to review what they've already read about the whole story and then try and draw their own conclusions about what happened. But you need to be very careful with this ending, or you might accidentally just leave it on a cliffhanger. The important difference here is that in a cliffhanger, the conflict hasn't been resolved yet, but in a mysterious ending, it has. The next ending, the reflective ending, is very similar to the mysterious ending in that the goal of it is to try to get your reader to think deeper. However, while the goal of the mysterious ending was to get your reader to think about what might happen after the story, a reflective ending is supposed to get your reader to think about the story itself and the world outside the story, the real world. And this can be done a couple different ways. If you want the reader to think about their life, then you may want to leave them with a message, some sort of moral to the story. You can also end it with a question directed at the reader. If you want the reader to think more deeply about your story, you might choose to not mention an important piece of the puzzle until the very last. However, that can be really hard to do without making your story confusing. Personally, I think I like this ending the best because I think it's the most effective. And what I mean by that is that because this ending is meant to get your reader to think more about your story, and apply it to their life, it makes your story much more memorable. I'm sure we've all seen, read, or heard stories that stay with us for a long time, either because we get to relate it back to our lives, or it was one that we had to think about a lot afterwards in order to properly understand. And that really is the goal of all of these endings. When your reader finishes your story, you want them to think that, looking back, there was no better ending for your story than the one you made. And if that happens, then you know that you wrote your story well. For your final activity, I want you to think ahead to what your ending might be. I want you to reflect on what you've already created and think about what ending would fit it best, while also fitting your vision of your story the best. And because everyone's story is different, everyone's endings are going to be different as well. But the main things you need to think about are what's going to happen, what will happen to your characters, what will they do, where will they go, and what events are going to lead you to that ending. What's going to make it make sense and make it flow smoothly? I by no means need your story completed today. You can take as much time as you'd like to perfect it and make it what you want. But it does help to look ahead to the future. So with that, I'll see you all back on the Hangout at 2:40, and I can't wait to see what you've created.